valuable sponsors. So I'd like to draw your attention, and your sample bags will give you their range of books. It is now, and that's enough of that, but as I could just repeat, a big welcome with our partners for today's conference. And it's also my pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Edwards, who will be providing us with the opening address. He's got a CV that looks like a telephone book, so I've truncated it a little bit. But let me put it to you this way. Peter Edwards is a writer, historian and biographer who has published extensively on Australian and international history and politics. He is currently an adjunct professor at Deakin University in Melbourne. He is a graduate of the University of Western Australia, a Rhodes Scholar, and obviously went to Oxford. And he has held visiting professorships and fellowships at several universities and research institutes throughout Australia and overseas. He's probably best known as the official historian of Australia's involvement in Southeast Asian conflicts. That's from 1948 through to 1975. And that includes obviously the Malaya and Borneo conflicts before, if you could call them conflicts, before Vietnam. He was made a member of the Order of Australia for his work as general editor of that 9-volume series and author of those volumes dealing with strategy and diplomacy called Crises and Commitments in 1992, and also A Nation at War in 1997. His other books include Arthur Tang, The Last of the Mandarins, which I'm sure a few of you remember that. He obviously liked Arthur because he edited his memoir, Defence and Policy Making, and then just to, if he didn't have enough to do, he arranged the Tang papers before they went off to the National Library of Australia. In 2009, he was made a Fellow at the Australian Institute of International Affairs, having served, or probably serving on their research committee, and he was a former editor of their journal, the Australian Journal of International Affairs. Peter Edwards' research interests include Australian, foreign, defence and strategic policies, with particular emphasis on the Australian-American alliance, Australia's relations with Southeast Asia, and the policy-making process. Extraordinary, as I said, his CV, the work he's done, and as I said, I'm delighted that Peter will be able to provide us with this opening address. Would you please welcome Peter?
Thank you, Jim, for that very generous introduction. After that, even I can really wait to hear what I have to say. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I do thank you very much for the honour of inviting me to open this conference. And first and foremost, I want to congratulate Military History and Heritage Victoria for organising the conference and the National Vietnam Veterans Museum for hosting it. Now, you'll expect me to say that, but it's no token statement. I think it's really important that a conference like this should be held, and should be held at this time. I say that because I believe we have a problem. By we, I mean not only Vietnam veterans, those close to them, people of that generation, but people of any generation interested in Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War and in, to use that time-honoured military phrase, the lessons learned from that controversial commitment. And the problem is this. We Australians tend to undertake most of our thinking and reflecting on questions of war and peace at major anniversaries. Now, normally there's nothing wrong with that. But over the next few years, there's going to be a real problem. Because the 50th anniversary of so many of the major turning points in Australia's Vietnam War happened to coincide with the centenary of the 1914-18 war. The 50th anniversary of the announcement of the commitment of 1RAR to Vietnam, often seen as the most significant step in the whole Australian commitment. It falls within 4 days of the centenary of the Gallipoli landing. And the 40th anniversary of the end of the war, it coincides with that anniversary as well. The 50th anniversary of Long Tan falls close to the centenary of Fromelles and the other great battles of 1916. The 50th anniversary of Tet, of Coral Balmoral, and all the other dramatic military and political events of 1968 will coincide with the centenary of the August offensives, the armistice, the opening of the peace conference at Versailles. Now, we know already that there will be enormous interest, enormous publicity in the centenary of Anzac and everything associated with it, and much else in the First World War. And of course that is quite proper. It's absolutely right that Australians should mark and reflect upon the enormous impact that the Great War, the war that alas did not end all wars, had on the world and not least on Australia. And I felt from my time as a trustee of the Shrine of Remembrance, when we were working on an education program there, I thought that if there's one statistic that every Australian child should learn, it is that Australia suffered the loss of 60,000 lives from a population of between 4 and 5 million. I heard just this morning, just reflecting on this, that the population of the Boston area is about 4.5 million. Imagine if Boston lost 60,000 people, right? What the impact would be. But it is a regrettable side effect, a sort of piece of collateral damage in historical terms, that this coincidence of timing, the 50th and the centenary, means that it will be very hard for any of us, veterans, historians, anyone interested in matters of national security and international affairs, to draw much of the public's attention in the coming years to the lessons to be learned from the Vietnam experience. And that matters. There are still important lessons to be learned from that experience that are of direct relevance to the issues facing Australia today and tomorrow. Just in the last few days and weeks, we've seen many comparisons with Vietnam drawn and debated, argued during discussions of, for example, the 10th anniversary of the Iraq commitment of 2003. And similarly, comparisons and contrasts are being made right now about the withdrawal from and the aftermath of the Vietnam commitment compared with the current withdrawal from and possible aftermath of the Afghanistan commitment. Now, none of that is to say that any two commitments are identical. As Mark Twain famously put it, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. The real value in placing current issues into their historical context comes from careful assessments of similarities and differences. And that's how we must learn from history. And of course, those lessons to be learned come in many areas: strategic, political, diplomatic, social, but of course, at the centre, operational. And the helicopter was, as you all know, ubiquitous in Vietnam, serving many purposes. But its value was not always understood. And the use of helicopters in support of ground operations was, particularly in the early years of the Australian commitment, a major issue in relations between the Royal Australian Air Force and the Army, at every level, from the men at the sharp end up to the chiefs of service. My colleagues on the official history discuss this in at least 3 volumes in some detail from the perspective of both services. And there's no doubt about the lasting impact of that inter-service tension. It's no coincidence, for example, that when the decision was taken in the 1980s to place the new generation of helicopters, the Black Hawks, under the Army rather than the Air Force, at that time the Chief of the Defence Force was not only an Army officer, but one who'd been a battalion commander in Vietnam. Part of the problem was a matter of service culture. For decades, the RAAF based its doctrine on the value of fixed-wing aircraft. It was part of Air Force culture that only a fixed-wing pilot, almost invariably a fighter pilot, had the credentials to be the service's chief. And this frustrated many in and around the defence environment. And I can remember quite clearly when it took until the 1990s, and in the 90s, the RAF started putting the word around. They said they'd pick someone, not a fighter pilot, who they thought was going to be an effective Chief of the Air Force, and even they hoped might go on to be Chief of the Defence Force. And that person, as it happened, not only was he not a fixed-wing pilot, he was a helicopter pilot. Now, the result, of course, was the appointment of Angus Houston, who's become one of the most widely respected Chiefs of the Defence Force of recent times. So I look forward today to hearing much of what was learnt at the time from the experience of using helicopters during the Vietnam War for many purposes, by many countries, and with many impacts. Conferences like this are occasions for recollection and reminiscence. Especially as we approach Anzac Day, it's an occasion to honour those who served, those who did not return, and not least those who returned impaired in whatever way. But the best way to honour service and sacrifice is to learn from experience and never to stop the practice of learning. And it's to that end that organisations like Military History and Heritage Victoria and the National Vietnam Veterans Museum contribute a great deal. I wish them well, I wish all of you well in that purpose today and well into the future. And I have great pleasure in officially declaring this conference open. Yes.